Welcome to Space Plus. This is a platform I created for anybody curious about what we're doing in space and how space impacts our daily lives. Now, most people will never get a chance to go to space, not at the current rate of space tourism growth. A handful of people have had that experience, and they've described it as profound, even if they've understood what to expect and how the Earth works and how orbits work and our relationship with the universe. It's a profoundly different experience to actually do it yourself and be there and take in that information firsthand. That profound shift is a documented effect that happens in the minds of most astronauts. The term for it is the overview effect. We've mentioned it a couple of times here on Space Plus already, but let's get into it a little bit more today. My guest in this episode is none other than Frank White, author, space philosopher, and consultant, and the man that first coined the phrase, the overview effect. How did you discover the phenomenon that you later dubbed the overview effect?
It's an interesting story, I think, because the overview effect has been really connected with astronauts in the popular mind. But way back in the 1980s, when I first had the epiphany about the overview effect, it wasn't about astronauts at all. It was about future people who would live off-world constantly or permanently. Maybe they would live on the moon. Maybe they would live on Mars. Maybe they would live on an O'Neill cylinder. And in fact, I was quite involved with Gerard K. O'Neill and the Space Studies Institute, and it shaped a lot of my thinking, So I was kind of obsessing about it, to be honest. What would it be like to live off the Earth? And I was on an assignment, consulting assignment, and I was flying cross country, and I was pondering this issue and looking out the window at the Earth, and it just hit me, well, if I lived on the moon or Mars, or actually we should come back to Mars because that doesn't really fit anymore, but if I lived on the moon or in an O'Neill community near the moon, I would see the Earth as a whole system. I would understand it as everything being interconnected and related to one another, and I would have an overview of the Earth. I would experience the overview effect. And so once I landed, I decided that what I really needed to do was interview astronauts as proxies, because they were the closest thing we could come to of permanent residence off of the Earth. So that's how the astronauts got involved. And it turned out that they are good proxies. The best we have. They confirmed a lot of my ideas, like, well, there are no borders, no boundaries, and things like that. But the big change is that I conceived the overview effect as ordinary. It would just be those people would live at a higher level of awareness than we do, but not in a surprising way. We look at the moon, we're not surprised there's a moon in the sky. I thought they would just see the Earth in the sky every day, and okay, well, that's part of my world. But for astronauts, it turned out to be, extraordinary, because it turned out to be a new perspective on the universe. And the truth is, from the surface of the Earth, you cannot get that perspective. And so every astronaut, every person who's flown started out on the surface. And so they have seen something remarkable. Oh, this is really incredible. And it's important to make that distinction, because some people have said, well, don't you think eventually we'll get used to the overview effect? It'll just be part of our lives? And I say, yes, that's what I'm talking about. We haven't gotten there yet. We're actually getting there without leaving the Earth, in the sense that there are videos, there are photos, there are astronaut discussions. The idea of the overview effect is becoming far more ordinary than it was in 1984 when I had the idea, in 1987 when my book came out.
And
But it's about consciousness evolving, is what I'm getting at.
yes. Can you set the scene for us, maybe, of the mindset of people who were paying attention to the space race in the 60s and the subsequent kind of era after that, where the kind of O'Neill rings that you speak about, and if you could explain those a little bit, but these kind of ideas where I guess I imagine there was almost an expectation, it was a given that we would be heading to space, that we wouldn't lose any of the momentum from the kind of Apollo era, and that these kinds of things that you're talking about, this higher understanding of our place in the universe and seeing the Earth, you know, from our space station, how normalized that would become. Would you say that was very much in the air, in the sort of expectation of that era when everyone was so excited about space for the first time round?
I would say that's certainly true for Americans. I don't know if it was true globally. I'm not quite sure at all what it was like in the Soviet Union. Of course, they led the way. They were far ahead of the Americans in any kind of race. I do believe the race was kind of made up, to be honest. We didn't have to go that way, and I'll say more about that later. But in any event, it was very exciting, I will say that. And it was also a time when the astronauts, the Apollo astronauts, began to share imagery that did have an enormous impact on the Earth, like the famous Earthrise photo. And that was a kind of beginning of the overview effect being transmitted back to surface dwellers, if you will. Yeah, I think especially people that I was, working with, we had hoped that we would go from the moon and onward. To be honest, in the NASA world, the O'Neill idea has never had a lot of traction. It briefly did. There was a period when there were NASA people interested, but I think NASA has typically taken a much more conventional approach. And it's even there today, the moon and then Mars, and it's incremental. And the thing about O'Neill was that shortly after the Apollo moon landing, when he was a professor of physics, he posed the question to his class, is a planetary surface the best place for a highly technological civilization to expand? And they concluded no, and it was pretty radical. No, it's a bad idea. And one of the reasons is gravity. The moon and Mars don't have a lot of gravity, but it's enough that, just like with Earth, you have to think about getting on, getting off, and dealing with gravity. Whereas O'Neill's idea is, let's use extraterrestrial materials like asteroids. We'll build these very Earth-like habitats, and we can actually have variable gravity within. Some people will spend time in zero gravity for fun. But once you're there, it's almost, how would I put it? It's easy to get anywhere in the solar system from an O'Neill community. And you also, another advantage, you would not be far from Earth, because these would be at Lagrange points between the Earth and the moon, where the two planetary bodies balance one another perfectly. And it's still a beautiful vision in my view. And if you want to have large-scale space migration where there are millions of people or billions of people living and working in the ecosystem of the solar system. Planetary surfaces, there's not enough planetary surfaces to do it properly. Um, we don't know much about, say, the moon's ability to support large numbers of people, but my sense is it's probably not there for a large community of humans. And the same with Mars. I don't think we can really get there with, and you know, Venus is very inhospitable. And yeah, can you hear my dog?
We have some dissenting opinions on that one.
Yeah, that's Moondog. Uh, anyway, so
I mean,
the
this
O'Neill
is
vision,
all like really science fiction kind of out there type of thinking, and it sounds like to me it was born out of this era where this was just the obvious next step, and it would kind of, like you
yeah,
say, become almost mundane, that we would be operating in space and carrying on. But it sounds like your research has kind of shown that rather than it being a kind of mundane day-to-day experience, that astronauts, even with various engineering degrees and the technical knowledge and the real grasp of how the world works, end up having an utterly profound and like paradigm shifting experience when they go
yeah.
into space. Is that actually how
Well,
it is, and is that fairly universal as well?
yeah, I would say most of them do have a paradigm shifting experience, but it's also not actually the same for everyone. And this is a distinction that is important to make. If you go on a suborbital hop or you go into orbit or you go to the moon, you will have an overview of the Earth. That original idea of, oh wow, it's all interconnected, it's all one system. You'll have that. How big an impact will it have on you? That's the effect. That will vary depending on you, and you won't have the exact same way of processing it as I will, or as you know, Edgar Mitchell did. And so we do have some people like Edgar Mitchell who went to the moon. Edgar Mitchell had spent a lot of time thinking about metaphysics, you might say, and he was very philosophically oriented. Coming back from the moon, he had done his job. He was just in the spacecraft, and you know what it's like when you have a big job to do and you succeed, and it's like, oh, okay, I can relax. And something happened, and he just became one with the universe. And it went way beyond looking at the earth and seeing borders and boundaries not being there. And on the other hand, the more common reaction is, oh, I was really amazed at how thin the atmosphere is. I really see why we have to take care of the earth, because we just have this thin atmosphere protecting us. And wow, what are we fighting about? There are no borders and boundaries. We're making this up. We're making it up, right? And then we come to the suborbital flights, which are now happening with commercial people. Um, Edgar Mitchell told me when I interviewed him that his experience as to the impact of a flight, it was all about how open were you? How open? And he said some of the guys, and he's talking about Apollo astronauts, some of the guys were very open, like me. And he said, I was out there, let's see what it means, what's going on here. And some of the guys were there like, no, I'm here to do a job, I'm going to do the job. And there was no impact, no information really came in that changed their worldview. And then we come to Blue Origin flights and William Shatner, the actor who played Captain Kirk. he had a reaction that looked to me a lot like Edgar Mitchell in the sense that he was overwhelmed. He wasn't prepared. He was really open. I think probably, I don't know this, I have no inside knowledge. I think probably he was offered a flight at the last minute and he thought, sure, why not? I don't think he was prepared. And that turned out to be good in a way because it really hit him. And the other part of it that happened with him, and I think it happened with Mitchell, is seeing not only the Earth in a new way, but the cosmos in a new way. A lot of astronauts talk about the universe is black, and it's very black in a way you can't imagine. Or if it's the right time, if you're on a nighttime pass, the universe is full of stars. And one astronaut said the universe isn't black, it's white because of all the stars. It depends on when you see it. But so I have really emphasized openness as a key to how the impact manifests itself. And also, it's going to be very interesting to see more commercial flights because the NASA astronauts and the Soviet cosmonauts and even Chinese, they call them taikonauts, or we call them taikonauts, I don't know. But they have a job to do. They're government employees, really. And they're not really there to experience the overview effect. But people who go on Virgin Galactic, Blue Origin, and so on, that's why they go, is for the experience. So we're going to see a greater variety of people. They're going to have a lot less training. They're going to be more open, And so, and it does seem to be universal. I just found two articles. One, I think, was by an Indian astronaut, the other a Chinese taikonaut. They both cited the overview effect.
Well, that's interesting because I was wondering how cultural this is, because when you are talking about how open the astronauts are to having some kind of profound experience or having their understanding shift, I think that's a lot to do with the culture that you grew up in and the stories that you are told about how to perceive of your place in the universe, how you think about time, how you think about your relationship to the environment. So it's actually most interesting to me how you've documented that this effect cuts across cultures by the sounds of it.
Right. And not only my work, but there was a study done at the University of British Columbia a few years ago. They didn't interview astronauts, but they looked at astronaut diaries and comments and evidence of what the experience was like. And they showed, I think it's about 125 different people from different cultures. And they did a pretty rigorous social science study of it. And they found across the board a movement from more individualistic values to more universal values. And it didn't seem to matter a lot whether it was American, Russian, et cetera. I think it's a human reaction because what's common, well, let me back up. What the astronauts talk about is what we have in common. No matter how different that person seems to be to you, and no matter the extent to which you have been trained to think of them as different or even the enemy, you're human. Both of you are human, and that's common. But I think that that's the key, is that we do have all of this in common, that we're brought up, we're born on the surface, we're brought up on the surface, and that is our perception. That is how our brain is wired. And you know, it's really a lie. What we what we think is true of our nature and our place in the universe is not true. Um, are you familiar with Plato's cave?
A little bit. I vaguely remember what it's about, but go for
Okay.
it.
Well, a lot of people have used this analogy, not just me, but I think it's appropriate. So he said, you know, the way people perceive reality today, and he wasn't really talking about space exploration, of course, but he was saying it's like all everyone is in a cave and they're chained to their seat and they're looking at a wall and there's a fire, and in modern terms we'd say there's a light on the wall, and there are people processing back and forth, and they're making puppet hand gestures, and the the people chained to their seats talk about what it all means, and they interpret this, and it's all an illusion. And he said, then one day a guy breaks out. He gets out of his seat. He goes out into the larger world, and he says, ah, there's a lot out here that we don't know about. And Plato said, when he goes back, the people will not believe him. They will not be able to grasp it, and they might even try to kill him. Now, I don't think that's happened yet.
Right.
However, I will say the following.
Hmm.
That analogy is so accurate because everybody on the surface is operating out of a mentality that is that we're on a stable platform, the heavens are revolving above us. And what is really important? Scotland, America, China. These are the really important distinctions. And the astronauts say, well, no, that's not true.
Yeah.
Earth is important. And
And
so, you know, the astronauts are coming back like the person who broke out of the cave.
right. And obviously, the amount of people that have actually been up there and seen this for themselves and come back is minuscule in the entire history of humanity. But I wanted to ask you about the time that our understanding possibly shifted quite a lot when Bill Anders, another NASA astronaut, took a photo that became known as Earthrise. I've got it on the screen while we're busy talking here. And I just wanted to get your perspective on how important you think this, maybe not this photo, but at least this scene. I know probes also took similar photos, satellites, but I'm talking about Bill Anders because a little bit like what you mentioned earlier with Mitchell, it wasn't part of the plan. It was a bit caught off guard. They turned around and there was the Earth rising, and they quickly ran to snap the picture, and they got it. So what I want to know from you is how important you think the Earthrise photo was to this understanding of ourselves. And for me, I'm wondering whether it's not too exaggerating to compare it to the time that we shifted our understanding from thinking we were the center of the universe to realizing that we were actually orbiting the sun. You know, is it that level of profound shift?
Yes, I think it is. I don't think you can overemphasize the importance of Earthrise in that, first of all of humanity was in that picture except for three people. That's been commented on before. It was a selfie, and it again was shocking. There's a beautiful little video that NASA put together of the sequence of events that led to that photo. And there's just one moment that I think captures the transformation. And I believe, I can't remember I think the speaker might have been Anders or it might have been Jim Lovell, but the commentary was, I'm looking at this crater. Can't tell if it's volcanic or not. He was trying to be a good scientist because he was sent to look at the moon, right? And then at some point he says, oh my gosh, look at that. That's so pretty. That's beautiful, right? And Frank Borman, the commander, says, oh, he says, get me a camera, quick, get me a camera. And Frank Borman says, no, don't take a picture of that. That's not on the schedule. And then they sort of start fighting over who's got the best angle to take the picture. Very human, very accidental. But then it also happened around Christmas time. And then they actually did this very special Christmas Eve broadcast where they shared the overview effect, the Earthrise, with the entire planet. And I do think it had a huge impact. And I think we know that the whole Apollo program gave a huge boost to environmentalism. And it also gave a huge boost to the idea of the overview effect or the consciousness of the overview effect. And one thing that's pretty exciting about the upcoming Artemis mission, even though I think it's going to be cut short by budgetary concerns, but there's a very small percentage of people alive on Earth today who actually experienced Earthrise. I'm sure you didn't. You look very young.
No, I was not around when that photo was first released.
Right. I once calculated only 17% of the people on the Earth today had a direct experience of that moment. And it's going to happen again now because we're going to have a flyby. And then we're going to have a landing, just exactly what happened back in 68, 69. And we'll see. One thing I've learned is not to prejudge what's going to happen.
Sure.
People told me, you can't experience the overview effect on a suborbital flight.
Right.
And I said, I don't know.
Yeah,
let's find out.
I mean, you famously had the first realization about this on an airplane.
That's right. And I often point out it was 25 years after Yuri Gagarin was the first person to experience the overview effect. So for 25 years, it had no name and it had no, documentation to speak of. And you definitely can have a mild version of it on an airplane. You definitely can.
I know. I have my face glued to the window when I'm on an airplane. I recently just flew to South Africa, so you had the entirety of the African continent to look down on. Europe also changes as well as you go through fields and then mountains. And although you can't, get the same level of curvature of the Earth or any of that, the sense of the planet being one system, one unbroken bit of land, it is very much the case. I wanted to ask about whether you think the Earthrise photo, and I mean, you've mentioned this a little bit already, whether the Earthrise photo played a role in kicking off the modern environmentalism movement. Because I see two sources often cited. One of them would be Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring. And I think it's very interesting that the Chinese sci-fi author Cixin Liu includes Silent Spring in his novel, The Three-Body Problem, which I'm not sure if you've read. But, it's the fact that the characters read that book and it goes on to have profound impacts for how we travel through the universe, I think is really interesting. So Silent Spring is certainly one part of our modern understanding, but surely Earthrise and views of the planet as this unbroken whole have also got to be a major impetus for it, right?
Yeah, definitely. And there's a book called Earthrise, When Man First Saw the Earth, I think it's called. And I'm trying to recall the name of the author. The author is in England, and if you look it up, he's a historian, and he states unequivocally as a historian that the Apollo missions in general, and Earthrise in particular, were very important to the environmental movement. I think Rachel Carson gets credit for starting it, but this happened. I think her book came out in 1961, so these missions were happening not long afterward. Yeah, I think there's no question about that. And yeah, I think too that we're going to see more of that as we have more missions. We're going to see more changes in awareness. And it's twofold. It's the astronauts going out and coming back. And now we have to talk about commercial astronauts going out, coming back. It's going to be a lot more people coming back. And then, we're going to have more and more photographs, more videos. Now, I recently did a virtual reality experience of astronauts working on the International Space Station.
Amazing.
And it was real.
Okay.
A group called Felix and Paul in Montreal have put together a series of virtual reality experiences.
Is it footage or is it graphics?
It's footage. It's real footage.
Wow.
They sent cameras to the International Space Station.
Amazing.
And the astronauts took the footage themselves. Their primary way of showing it is you go into a big space like a warehouse, and they give you a headset, and you can actually move around in there, and you can go into the International Space Station. You can go on a spacewalk. And I had not done this. I still haven't done the warehouse thing called the Infinite, is what they call it. But this is some of the footage they use. And I was saying, excuse me, I was saying to my friends who were listening to me and watching me, and I was saying, this is what the astronauts been telling me. This is what they've been telling me. It's amazing. It's incredible. And that was virtual reality. So now imagine the real thing. And I think that, so we're going to have commercial astronauts and professional astronauts going out, having experiences, coming back and sharing them. And then we're going to have increasingly better ways to simulate the experience. And my organization, the Human Space Program, is committed to what we call bringing the overview effect down to Earth by supporting astronauts in every way and supporting simulations in every way that we can, so that people can begin to have a shift in awareness that could affect how we behave on Earth. So right now, most people on Earth are still operating out of a nationalistic view.
Yes.
Of the world, because that's what we know. And you can see it. I don't have to give you chapter and verse of the outcome of that, right?
Yeah, of course.
I don't have to explain to you why that's not a good worldview. It's
No.
not a good worldview. It produces bad outcomes. So what we hope to do is create a more earthly or earth-oriented worldview.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I want to make the point, just because the astronauts say there are no borders and boundaries, it does, that's not an opening to a one world government or anything like that.
Sure, right.
It's just to understand they're not real.
These are
They're
all
not
just
real.
shared ideas we've agreed to go along with,
Yeah.
basically. But, we can also imagine a different world without them, I suppose.
And in the United States for me is a good example. We have states. We have Vermont and we have California. We have Michigan and we have Florida. They're very different. Their cultures are different. Their politics are different. And they have borders, but the borders aren't barriers. And the United States is constantly on the verge of breaking up. And we did break up once. But the understanding is we're stronger together, and we like the differences, but we do understand that in a way there's a larger whole system, and that's called the United States. And there's England, there's Great Britain, there's the United Kingdom. It's the same thing. I mean, I don't want to go into the history of Scotland and England, but you know what I'm talking about.
I do. Yeah, I do. And I think you're right that just the moment that you have the ability to zoom out and take in that we are already in space, we're on a planet in space,
right?
And that's what it looks like, and that's the reality of how we need to think about where we go forward. These systems are systems from the 16th, 17th centuries that we're still practically operating in, and we need a different idea. I was wondering if there's any great examples from the creative industries. I'm thinking here art, music, science fiction that we've mentioned, that are doing something interesting with the overview effect. I mean, you and I first connected some time ago over the prog rock artist Steven Wilson, who just released an album about the overview effect, or at least inspired by the overview effect. Have you got any other examples that you can think of where you've seen this idea woven into interesting work?
I think the area I've done the most research on and which shows great promise is the arts. I don't know Steven Wilson, and as you and I have discussed, I'd love to talk to him if we can work it out. But in 2019, I was invited to come to the International Astronautical Conference in Washington, D.C., and to talk about the overview effect in the arts. And I started doing research. I was overwhelmed, Stuart. And this was 6 years ago. Where do you start? There are poems about the overview effect. There are symphonies about the overview effect, or even called the overview effect. There's a band in Australia called the Overview Effect. If you go on YouTube to look at videos titled The Overview Effect, I lost count. I tried to count them. It's just too much. The overview effect is really attractive to artists, and I think it's because A, it's about exploration, and B, it's hard to communicate it, and artists, they say, let me take a crack at communicating it. And it's also important. And I think what artists want to do is talk about what does it mean to be human, and what is the meaning of humanity. And the overview effect is like a key. Maybe with this, if we can understand this, we can understand humanity better. And it's true, actually, because it is, number one, it's the story of 8 billion people on a spaceship. And they don't know they're on a spaceship. And there's about 1,000 people who are running around saying, we're on a spaceship, folks.
Not enough.
Not
Not enough people. Yeah.
Yeah.
And how does that feel for you? Let's talk about your legacy in a way. It's so important to us to have something named. We mentioned
Yeah.
this earlier, but the experience existed from when Yuri Gagarin first went up, but we didn't have a name for it. And the moment that we can stick a label on something, again, it's the
Yeah.
human brain, right? It makes me think about a quote that I've seen in a conservation context by Baba Diyung, which goes, "We will conserve only what we love. We will love only what we understand, and we will understand only what we are taught." And I feel like what you've done by coining this phrase is help us understand. And I just wonder how it feels to have this as your legacy, the guy that coined a phrase, and to see it. It maybe, I would argue, has taken quite a while. I mean,
Yeah.
the book came out in '87, right? Was the
Yeah.
first time that you published the book. It's really kicking off now and gaining momentum now, but it's taken a long time. But now that you do see all of these wonderful iterations of it, how does that feel?
Terrific. It feels great. I mean, as an individual who, you know, I I studied social science in college, and my heroes were Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, political philosophers who people still study their thinking today. And I guess when I was in college, I thought, wow, if I only could do something like that. I don't know if it was ever conscious, but they were heroes to me, intellectual giants. Um, and so there's the personal achievement, but then there's the importance of what it might do for the planet. That is the ultimate reward. And I don't know that we've gotten there yet, right? Um, it would be cool. That's not the right word. It would be a mark of success if people negotiating a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, if somebody would stand up and said, "Have you guys heard about the overview effect? You know, we got to take this from a different perspective."
Interesting.
If it started to permeate behavior in that way, I would feel really gratified. I do want to say, backing up a little bit, that credit where it's due. One of my colleagues today, Stan Rosen, actually did research on the overview effect before I did.
Okay.
He started interviewing Apollo astronauts, and I've read some of what he wrote, and it was the overview effect. He got it. The difference between Stan and me is that he didn't give it a name and he didn't publish a book. He wrote in fairly limited circulation journals, right? But he should get a lot of credit because he did, quote unquote, discover it. But that goes back to why the naming is important. You need something everybody can use. And some of the astronauts have said, Frank gave us the terminology to talk about what we experienced. And and the other thing that's really important is a lot of people think that I just came up with the name after interviewing a lot of astronauts, and it's backwards. I experienced a mild version of the overview effect while I was on a plane. The name came to me, is what I'm saying.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Yeah, and it means a lot to me because the other piece of the story I want to tell you is that I was naive, Stuart, but I honestly thought when the book was published in 1987, a revolution in consciousness would start. And I didn't have a backup plan. I thought I thought the book is going to be a bestseller. I'm going to be a full-time writer, the whole world is going to change.
Right.
That didn't happen.
Well, I
And
find it curious that you have spoken to astronauts from across the major spacefaring nations, and space is hard and it's expensive. So there's a reason why it's kind of the richest countries in the world that also have a space program most of the time. But it's interesting to me how the countries that have astronauts that have this profound experience and have a maybe greater understanding of the planet are the same countries responsible for the most carbon emissions and damage to the planet. And, we've spoken about obviously the positive elements of this legacy of yours, but it must be frustrating as well to realize that. And that's not the fault of the astronauts, and that's not the fault of anybody else. It's not your fault, certainly. Is that just we don't listen? We don't take in these things? We should have had the kind of cultural revolution that you're talking about, but did it fall on deaf ears, or how do you get the people that make the decisions to get it and to understand it, I suppose?
yeah, that's a tough question. And I mean, just one comment. I think the space industry really does have to think about the way we get people into orbit and the impact on the environment. Even if it's not that big an impact, I mean, we could do studies and say, oh, compared to the airline industry, it's not that big a deal. But that's not really a good argument. I think the better argument is, yeah, we're working on it. We're environmentalists too. We do care about that. And I've always said everybody must be an environmentalist because destroying the earth is a bad idea. And especially when you see there is nowhere else for humans to live, really. So I think that's number one. I think number two, a lot of other countries are attempting to create a space program. Several African countries are working on it. They usually focus on the practical benefits to their people, and how can they get jobs for their people? How can they use satellites to benefit farmers and things like that? So ultimately, I think that the benefits can be and should be shared. But the larger question, I think it just takes a long time for society to absorb new ideas. I did some research once for a course at Harvard on the shift from geocentric to heliocentric thinking. I was astonished to find that the model of the solar system that was heliocentric was available 1,000 years before Kepler. It was available. The time wasn't right, and also, Copernicus actually. Copernicus did not publish his book about the heliocentric universe until he was on his deathbed because he was afraid of the reaction he would get.
He was a Catholic cleric himself, wasn't he?
I think he was, yeah.
Yeah,
And
so there were doing huge implications
yeah.
For releasing that during his lifetime.
I want to also pose an idea to you that's come to me lately. And this is one of the enjoyable aspects of being involved in the space field. I think, in a way, hypernationalism is related to the overview effect. I think it's a reaction against it. I think hypernationalism is a reaction of, I don't want that to be true.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want it to be an interconnected world where we're all in it together. I am against that.
Yeah, like it's the sort of dying throes of an old system of thinking that's trying to push back against this more enlightened awareness.
Right. And unfortunately for that viewpoint, one of the things I've said is that the overview effect is about three different aspects. One is truth. It's the truth of where we are in the universe. We're not on a stable platform with you know with little lines drawn on the earth, pink. Oh, that's Uganda. It's pink, and Kenya is green, and it's not like that. It's just a fact. We're not like that. We're on an organic spaceship, and it's also about love. I've found more increasingly that people who fly, when they first see the Earth, they cry, and they find themselves. I love the Earth. I love it, and then it's about identity, which is the most important, ultimately, on politics, which is there's a movement from me to we. There is an understanding that we're all in this together. And again, we have differences, and that's understandable. As I said before, um, you know, there's a healthy rivalry between Massachusetts and New Hampshire. I mean, we're one state very close to the other, and
Go on, which side of the fence are you on then?
yeah, I think Massachusetts is the best, but actually, I think New Hampshire. No, I think Maine might have actually been part of Massachusetts once,
All right.
and they became an independent state. So difference is important, and that's one of the aspects of the overview effect. It's not that everything is unified and one, and there is no diversity. I mean, there is diversity, there is difference. And when astronauts come back to Earth, that image stays with them of the whole Earth, but they quickly have to adjust to a more diverse, divided reality. And we have to learn to hold two different things in our minds at once.
Yeah, I think everything that you said really is resonating. I mean, I think you've also picked out three of the most contentious topics in our world today as well. I mean, we're having arguments about truth, like what is true, that we didn't have. We've kind of gone backwards in terms of, a sort of agreement about what things are true or not. Love is a very contentious thing. There's a lot of hate online as well. And identity has been politicized in so many fields. So these are really critical issues. And if anybody can take away a more enlightened and nuanced understanding of those three things, from grasping what it is that looking back on the planet gives you, I mean, that is a really positive thing. Obviously, there's only so much that anybody watching this interview could go away and do. Now that we've heard about the overview effect, what do you encourage people to go away and do? Like, is it just something they should go and research? Is it something they can try and write about or explore? What do we do with this new knowledge that you've just imparted on us?
Yeah. Well, that's a really good question. Certainly, a lot of people get in touch with me, and I'm happy. I do my best to respond to everyone. Didn't you get in touch with me?
That's right, yeah.
You got, and I responded.
Yeah, our wonderful mutual connection, Rachel Lyons from Space for Humanity, who is such a cheerleader and such a champion of what the overview effect can do. And and Space for Humanity, I think you sit on the board, don't you? So I don't need to explain it to you. But, the idea of taking ordinary people and giving them the opportunity to go on one of these commercial flights and experience the overview effect themselves I mean, that's incredible, but obviously, however, that's still a fairly rare thing for most people,
Yeah.
who aren't going to get that opportunity.
I think the first thing I would say for people who are totally new to this idea is to learn more and get into it and find their own place in this new paradigm, right? Because uh, you're doing it. You looked at, well, this is really exciting. What can I do? So you said, I'll interview Frank. That was a good first step. There are other people who I really do recommend going online and looking for something called Down to Earth NASA on YouTube. What that gives you is a build out of something I did in 2019. I went to Johnson Space Center and I interviewed several astronauts about their experience of the overview effect. And that triggered a whole series of interviews. There's about 30 short astronaut interviews, like 3 minutes. You won't even know I'm there because they didn't focus on me, they focused on the astronaut. And then they put it all together into something called the astronaut's perspective. It's an Emmy nominated documentary about what we're talking about. You'll get a really good sense of what the overview effect is. There's also a film on Vimeo called Overview, about 10 years old, but still excellent. And it's about 19 minutes long. Edgar Mitchell is in it before he passed away. That's what I would say. And then the other thing I would say is look at what you're doing today and see if you can adapt what we're talking about to what you're doing. Are you an artist? Are you a writer? Are you a blogger? Or are you a leader of a manager? After learning about this mentality, can you apply it? A friend of mine who didn't know much about the overview effect, and I hadn't seen him in a long time, he came back into my life and we started talking about what we've been doing the last 25 years. And I told him about the overview effect. And he said, I think it's a boundary object. I said, how can it be a boundary object? It's about no boundaries. And he told me that there was a researcher in the 80s who was looking at organizations and how they could be effective. And at the time, the consensus was that people working in an organization needed to have consensus. They needed to agree on things, right? To be effective. And she found, no, that's not what you need. You need a boundary object, which might not be the best name for it, but you need an idea that's very coherent at the center and very plastic at the edges, so that people who don't agree have some language they can use to work together.
Interesting.
And I think that's a perfect description of the overview effect, because there are people using the term, there are people using the idea in their work as like organizational consultants and so on. And they don't even know where the idea came from. And I mean, if I met them, they might totally disagree with me.
Sure.
But you know what I mean?
Yeah.
If it's something that you can adapt to your life, there's no overview effect police saying you can't do that. You know what I mean? I do have a trademark on it, which I can use, but I don't. I don't want to restrict its use. I want it to get out there. And just a very quick story, I interviewed Sir Richard Branson for one of the editions of my book, and he's a very easy guy to hang out with. And so at one point I said, Richard, aren't you selling the overview effect with your space company? And he said, oh, yes, we are. We'd love to use your brand. And I said, Richard, I want you to use it, please. And it's really funny because they do. Virgin Galactic uses the term overview effect as what you're going to get out of flying with them. And I read an article by somebody who said, this is just terrible. Richard Branson and other commercial people are using the term overview effect. And I had to laugh because I gave him permission.
Right. You could be sitting on a big pile of money now, but that's not in the spirit of the entire concept, is it?
No. I mean, that's not what I wanted to do with it.
No.
Now, going back to 1987, if the book had sold a lot of copies, that would have been perfect because then more people would be reading it and I might be sitting on a pile of money. Yeah, I'm not worried about it, really. You've talked about before a legacy. That's what I care about. And I don't know, ever since I was a little kid, I wanted to help make the world a better place. And this is my way of doing it. And again, I've said this and I have to say it again. I'm not the hero of the story, the astronauts are, because every time they get onto a rocket ship, they risk their lives to bring back this very important knowledge. And some of them don't make it. It's spaceflight is still extremely dangerous. I don't care what you're flying on, whether it's a commercial flight or NASA flight or how you do it. And that was proven recently with the Starliner, which was going to be the alternative way to go to the International Space Station.
Yes.
The two astronauts took it there and they almost couldn't make it dock. It was almost a disaster. Everybody was wringing their hands that they were stuck on the ISS, but they were alive.
Yes.
And, that particular spacecraft was not functioning very well, and it turned out okay, but it didn't have to. So the astronauts are still the heroes of the story.
And this is still hard-won knowledge. This is still a perspective that is so rare and so precious. And so it's great to hear that you've given us practical ways, us Earth dwellers, us land dwellers, to go and borrow something from the idea and explore it on our own terms. And thank you for your work, and thank you for that approach, because you didn't have to have thought about it that way. And this is much more open, it's much more inclusive. And I think that while I'm sitting here in Scotland and we're looking at a burgeoning and growing space sector, not human spaceflight, but more about satellites and what Earth observation from a satellite perspective in low Earth orbit, what that can do for tackling all sorts of societal problems, tackling the issues around climate change, and having a full-on industry where we're building them here in Scotland, we're launching them here in Scotland, and we're processing the data back in Scotland. Our role in space will continue to grow, and I think that any aspect of having a better understanding of space, having a closer relationship with space, needs some proper, what's the word? We need to think about it properly. We need to examine it properly. It's not all naturally good. I'm concerned about some of the things that are happening in space and some of the growth of the sector. And so to balance that all out, I think finding a really positive takeaway from our time in space, despite the danger, despite the concerns about where it's going, that's what I wanted to highlight by talking to you today. So yeah, just to kind of wrap things up, just to say thank you very much for your openness, and your approach to sharing the concept with the world. I think it's great.
Well, thank you very much. And I think that, you know, one of the areas that many of us in the space community have organized around is that whatever we do off world, it should benefit Mother Earth, or as my friend Rick Tomlinson calls it, the Mother World. And we should always have that dual concept. Yes, we're exploring, we're going out there, we're looking to see how can it benefit us in general. But if we always have that anchor back on Mother Earth, I think we won't go wrong, and it'll be the greater good for the greater number, and that's very, very important. And you know, I'm glad you brought up what can people do, because my legacy, if there is one, uh, needs to go beyond writing books, and it needs to go into practical, beneficial activities by people on spaceship Earth.
I think Scotland could play a really critical role in doing things the right way, taking the principles of sustainability and not just the sort of greenwashing version of that, but to actually embed it in at the
Right,
ground level, and to take, again, a positive perspective on why we're even going to space in the first place. And
right.
that's my hope, and that's what I hope that we cover more of here on Space Plus as well. So hopefully, we'll have you back again in the future when rockets are taking off from Scottish soil. I'm quite excited for that.
I can't wait. I'll come back anytime.
Thank you, Frank. Thanks so much for your time today.
But okay.